joined with us tonight to bring Dr. Pry to Colorado. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Restrooms, I think a few of you already found them. If you need to use the restroom, since we are filming, if you not walk down the center aisle, but walk to the sides and then slink along underneath the camera, you go out, out the double doors, through the cafeteria and down the hall for the restrooms. You notice that we've got some order forms on your chairs. We are taping the event tonight. The DVDs and CDs will be printed immediately after the event. So if you're wanting a DVD of tonight's event, we'll have them right back here at the table afterwards, and I'll talk a little bit more about what to do with them when we finish tonight. When we're done, as you might guess, I need to put chairs away. So if I have 4 or 5 guys that would come up here afterwards, and I'll tell you how we need to stack things and just help us put things back in order, that would be greatly appreciated. We will do some Q&A as soon as Dr. Pry is finished with his presentation. We'll have a roving mic, so if you want to ask him a question, just raise your hand, and Candy will be working around the room with the microphone. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Bill to introduce Dr. Pry.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks so very much for being here. To my mind, this could not be a more timely presentation given what's going on in the world these days. We all know, for example, that North Korea and Iran are 2 rogue states that are very hostile to the United States and many of our regional allies. And what's even worse is that they are both working feverishly to develop an operational nuclear-tipped ballistic missile capability to use against us. One of the most worrisome aspects of that particular menace is the possibility of a detonation of 1 or more nuclear warheads high above the atmosphere over our land, which could have catastrophic results in terms of the destruction of our electrical and electronics infrastructures. We depend on those infrastructures for our day-to-day living at every level and every way, so we're looking at possible threats to not only our nation but our very civilization. We're fortunate this evening particularly to have with us a genuine expert on this matter of many years standing, and he's here to explain to us the nature and the dimensions of this threat, what our federal government is and is not doing to safeguard against it, and what needs to be done going forward to protect us in the event of such an eventuality, because as I mentioned, it could be a true catastrophe for all of us in every way. Dr. Vincent Pry has had a long and distinguished career in the national security arena. At the Central Intelligence Agency, he was an intelligence officer responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy and operational plans, as well as developing American paradigms for strategic warning. At the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, he served as a verification analyst responsible for assessing Soviet compliance with strategic and military arms control treaties. Dr. Pry has also served as professional staff on several congressional strategic assessment and posture commissions, and for the House Armed Services Committee, advising on a wide array of issues of concern in the national security arena. Today, he is executive director of a congressional advisory board that is known as the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, which is dedicated to achieving protection for the United States against this very threat of electromagnetic pulse and cyber attacks and all other manner of mass destruction terrorism to our critical civilian infrastructures. Dr. Pry is also the director of the U.S. Nuclear Strategy Forum and Advisory Board to Congress on policies to counter weapons of mass destruction. He is the author of several related books and often appears on television and radio as an expert on national security issues. With two PhDs to his credit, one in American history and one in international relations and strategic studies, he is truly a national asset for our nation's national security. Please give a warm Colorado welcome to Dr. Peter Vincent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank all of you. I'm just amazed at this audience that so many would come out on a Friday night and pay $10 to listen to me talk. That's just amazing. You are all patriots of the EMP and cyber age, and it's people like you that are going to save our country, from this threat. Because just by learning about it, you become at least a small part of the solution. And the biggest part of this threat is that most of the American people still don't know about it, don't understand it's real, and don't understand how serious it is. And that's why you're going to be here tonight, what I hope to do tonight, to offer you this information. Normally, the way I'd like to do is give this briefing, and it'll probably take about an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions. You know, I don't know that briefing for an hour is always the wisest thing. When I was a CIA analyst, it always seemed to be the case that the effect of a briefing was always inversely proportional to its length. You know, but we will hope that that is not the case today and break precedent. Another thing we would do in the agency, I will give you this briefing the way we would a CIA type briefing, you know, is that first you tell the audience what you're going to tell them, then you give them the briefing, and then you tell them what you've told them, okay? And I probably only have to tell you once because you're not members of Congress, and so it would stick. It'd stick, you know, the first time. But in effect, you know, what I'm going to tell you tonight is this thing, electromagnetic pulse, that we're going to talk about, is the greatest single threat facing our civilization. It's the greatest single threat facing our civilization right now. And it's an imminent threat. And it can be caused by nature, by the sun, by solar storms that can generate a natural EMP that can destroy electronics and electric grids and put the whole planet at risk, billions of lives at risk, everybody in the world at risk. It can be caused by the detonation of a single nuclear weapon by terrorists or rogue states or Russia or China over the territory and create an EMP, a single nuclear weapon that would basically destroy electronics across an entire continent. And the bad guys have developed a new way of warfare that's based on this. Their version of cyber warfare, they see EMP as a cyber weapon, and they combine it with what we think of as cyber attacks, things like computer hacking and viruses that you would instill into the SCADA systems and computerized systems, combined with physical sabotage, non-nuclear radio frequency weapons that would create a non-nuclear EMP, but the ultimate cyber weapon in their military writings and doctrine, and then in their exercises, is a nuclear EMP attack. And that, if people remember nothing else, you know, from the briefing tonight, it's to remember that their theory of war, this new way of warfare that they've invented, you know, their version of a cyber, combined armed cyber warfare, you know, is very different from ours. It involves nuclear EMP attack. We don't get that. You know, today, President Trump, of whom I'm a supporter and an admirer, all right, he signed today, it's interesting, we were having this briefing today, he signed an executive order on cybersecurity today, just today, and it's been put out. And it doesn't have a word about EMP in it. You know, it doesn't have a word about EMP in it because our guys who are planning for cyber warfare don't understand the other side's military doctrine and strategy, and that can be a fatal mistake. We'll get more into that later, but those are the basic lessons. EMP is the greatest and most imminent threat our civilization faces. It can be caused by nature and man. And I almost forgot the last point. There's no excuse for us to be vulnerable to EMP. No excuse. We've known for 50 years how to protect against it. We know we have the technology. It's been well understood. It's not the cost. It's not that expensive. It's the politics that have stopped us from protecting ourselves. And it's the politics of EMP that threaten to get our civilization killed. Let's talk about the natural EMP from the sun. This is an actual satellite photograph. We weren't able to photograph these things until recently. Just a few years ago, we put up satellites that were able to photograph the coronal mass ejections. And that is an actual photograph of what a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection looks like coming off of the sun. The common parlance for it is a solar flare. But what it is a great big chunk of the sun that's thrown out of the sunspots in the sun, which are holes that go into the sun. And it's like an electromagnetic cannon that shoots out this big blob of ionized plasma, which goes out random into space. And this is the size of the Earth compared to one of these coronal mass ejections. It's many times larger than the Earth. And it travels, a normal one travels at 1 million miles an hour. A Carrington-class one is much more energetic and travels at 3 million miles an hour. You know, a normal coronal mass ejection that causes a run-of-the-mill geomagnetic storm that wouldn't end civilization. It takes about 3 days to cross the distance from the sun to the Earth. The Carrington event, when it happened in 1859, crossed the distance from the sun to the Earth in 11 hours because it was so much faster. And what was the Carrington event? What is this natural EMP? Let's just start off with a physics 101 here about, well, what is EMP, since we're going to be talking about it all evening. In physics 101, you know, a moving magnetic field will generate a current in a wire, okay? That's all an EMP is. It's the phenomena that results from a moving magnetic field that generates a current in a wire. And the current is just electrons being moved in a wire. You know, if you understand how a lawnmower works, you can understand EMP. You know, what happens when you pull the cord on a lawnmower is you're spinning a bunch of magnets called a magneto. And this causes a moving magnetic field in the heart of your lawnmower. And there's a coil of wires around that magneto. And the electrons and the wires move. And that generates a current. And it creates a small electromagnetic pulse in the form of a spark on your spark plug that you can actually see. Now, the Earth is a giant magnet. And it's got a north and a south pole. And it's surrounded by this thing called a magnetosphere. And it's the magnetosphere that keeps us from being burned to a crisp and irradiated by these coronal mass ejections on the occasions that they strike the Earth. Otherwise, we'd all be dead. But one of the things that happens in the process of saving us from the coronal mass ejection is the magnetosphere gets distorted because you've got this blob of ionized plasma smashing into it at 1,000,000 miles an hour. In the case of a Carrington event, it'd be 3,000,000 miles an hour. And it makes the magnetosphere wobble around and move. So all over the world, you end up with a moving magnetic field. And now we've scaled up the principle that makes your lawnmower run, but it's now scaled up to a planetary scale. And consequently, the forces we're talking about are immense. And instead of just a little spark here, we're talking about voltages that are thousands of volts. There was a solar storm called the Hydro-Quebec storm in 1989. This was not a Carrington event. It didn't end civilization. It was a little more powerful than your ordinary storm, which happens every year, usually at nations in high northern latitudes. Russia, Finland, Sweden, Alaska. Well, this one blacked out half of Canada in 90 seconds and caused the extra high voltage transformer at a nuclear reactor in New Jersey to melt in 90 seconds. This EHV transformer was designed ordinarily to carry 750,000 volts. Imagine that amount of energy, 750,000 volts, and it melted in 90 seconds because it couldn't handle the power of that pulse from a geomagnetic storm that we estimate was 1% the power of the 1859 Carrington event. Now, in 1859, when that's the most powerful solar storm, we call them solar superstorms, this particular rare class, this rare solar storm that happens once every 100, 150 years. In 1859, when it happened, we weren't an electronic civilization. You know, electricity and electrical devices were a novelty. The colonial powers had built railroads all over the world, in India, China, Africa, all over Europe. And wherever there was a railroad, they strung telegraph lines. So there were telegraph lines all over the world, too. And we had just laid the transatlantic cable in 1859. The United States ship with Great Eastern laid the transatlantic cable. And when the Carrington event happened, you know, the pulse was so powerful, you know, it caused fires to break out in telegraph stations. Telegraph keys operated on their own. Telegraph keys actually melted. If you've ever seen a telegraph key, I mean, it's a big, robust chunk of metal, and that thing melted. Think of what that would do to the modern diodes in computer systems that are designed to operate on micro fractions of a volt versus a telegraph key. There were forest fires all over the world because the telegraph lines burst into flame and caused forest fires. And the pulse was so powerful, it reached down into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean and burned out the transatlantic cable that had just been laid miles deep. And that had to be relayed. Now, in those horse and buggy days, it wasn't the end of the world, you know. This only affected, you know, communications and some of the wealthy people who were playing the stock market and things like that, you know, back in those days. But it wasn't a civilizational catastrophe by any means. If something like that happened today, though, it would be a catastrophe, not just for our nation, but for the entire world. And it almost did happen. See the date up there, July 23rd, 2012? a coronal mass ejection like that crossed the path of the Earth and narrowly missed us by 3 days on that date. And NASA basically put out a report and said, had this thing hit the Earth, that would have been it. You know, electric grids and life-sustaining critical infrastructures everywhere in the world, because everything that supports life depends directly or indirectly on our electric grid now. Communications, transportation, water, food, all of that. You know, in order to sustain the large populations we have in our modern civilization, you know, we need the electric grid and we need these advanced technologies. This country can't support 320 million people without electricity and all the other modern infrastructures that we have. You know, if you go back and you look at what our population was, you know, like at 1900, before we had electricity and our modern critical infrastructures, it was less than 100 million people. And 75% of the people back in those days were farmers. And every man-jack of them was only 1 generation removed at most from pioneer stock. They knew how to live off the land and take care of themselves. Today, you know, less than 2% of our population feeds the other 98%. And most people don't know how to even hunt and fish, even for recreation, let alone to survive. The water systems, you know, that we have today, immediately you'd lose water, you know, because it requires vast amounts of electricity to purify water and pump water and deliver it. And the food, we only have enough food to feed 320 million people for 30 days, stockpiled in the big regional food warehouses at normal consumption rates. You know, your normal local grocery store has enough food to feed people for about 2 to 3 days at normal consumption rates. And the food in those big regional food warehouses, when the lights go out, when you lose electricity, it immediately begins to spoil. You know, because you need refrigeration, temperature-controlled systems, all that stuff to keep the food wholesome. So basically, you would have, in the aftermath of a natural EMP or nuclear EMP event or some kind of grid failure, you would have less than 30 days food supply, much less. And that's why the EMP Commission, on which I serve, one of the credentials my friend, you know, perhaps forgot to mention, I'm the Chief of Staff now of the Congressional EMP Commission, is we estimate that in 1 year, 9 of 10 Americans would die from starvation, disease, and societal collapse, you know, because the grid is unprotected, because we don't know how to keep 320 million people alive with only a 30-day food supply for a year, or with no water. And we also know, just from hurricanes and the like, that societal chaos breaks out like 24 hours after the lights go out. Think of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and think of New York City after the 1967 blackout. You know, 550 police officers were injured in the riots that happened 24 hours after the lights went out in New York City in 1967. So that is the natural EMP threat from the Carrington event. And this isn't some hypothetical thing. This is for sure. This is 100% certainty that this is going to happen someday. You know, and the someday, according to NASA, is 12% per decade. That's their estimate, 12% per decade. And that virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes, or that of our children, we will experience this unprecedented catastrophe of a Carrington-class geomagnetic superstorm. And there's no deterring it. There's no negotiating with the sun. You know, we have only one alternative to deal with this, and that is we need to protect ourselves by hardening the grid. Hardening the grid. There's no excuse to be vulnerable to this. We know how to protect against it, but we haven't done it, and that's another story. Let's go to the next. The nuclear EMP attack. I've spent almost a half an hour just talking about the first slide, Carrington event. The higher you go with a nuclear weapon, the bigger and bigger the EMP field gets, the more and more area covered. So that inner ring, if you detonated a nuke at that altitude, the EMP field would extend for 30 kilometers. That's, at a 30-kilometer altitude, it would extend for 600 kilometers in all directions. And how do you get a nuclear weapon to 30 kilometers altitude? You could do it with a weather balloon. You know, you could do it, well, you could do it with a private jet doing a zoom climb. There are cruise missiles that can go that high, a short-range ballistic missile, a Scud launched off a freighter. All kinds of delivery means could do that. Terrorists could do that quite easily. And that scenario, the least threatening of these rings, could end our civilization. Because if Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the North Koreans decide to use a short-range missile to put that over the eastern part, anywhere over the eastern part of the United States, you know, what will happen is it'll immediately cause the protracted collapse of the eastern grid. Our country is divided into 3 electric grids: the eastern grid, the western grid, and the Texas grid. And the most important of them is the eastern grid. You know, we can't survive as a civilization without the eastern grid because it supports most of our population and it generates 75% of our electricity. And most of our nuclear reactors are also located in the eastern grid. You know, 7 days after the blackout begins, the reactors go Fukushima because their emergency generators and batteries run out, and the same thing would happen to those reactors that happened in Japan. You know, the water will boil away and the nuclear reactor cores will overheat and the fuel rods and the cooling ponds will overheat and you get steam explosions. Steam doesn't sound very threatening, but it is when it's highly radioactive. And these steam explosions create plumes that would carry the radioactive contamination all over the eastern half of the country, just from that first one. And that's the least threatening of the EMP scenarios. You know, the most threatening of them is this one, which is what many of us fear North Korea might be able to do right now. That's an altitude of 400 kilometers. The satellite that you mentioned, of which North Korea has orbiting over us two satellites, KMS-3 and the KMS-4. We'll talk more about that later. So, with the nuclear EMP can't be used to attack the whole world with one weapon, but you can take out an area like that, the size of a continent, the United States, Canada, and a good chunk of Mexico. And there's a third class of EMP weapons, non-nuclear EMP weapons, radio frequency weapons. Now this is actually not a weapon. It's a legitimate diagnostic tool, but anybody can buy it. You don't need a license to buy it. And the manufacturers themselves aren't really aware that they're selling a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, it's not, you can't see it well on the view graph, but here they actually put the waveform up. You know, and it shows that it goes to 100 kilovolts per meter. You know, that's 100,000 volts per meter. You know, the way we measure the power of an EMP weapon is the volts it can insert into a target per meter. So if the target is 2 meters long, that's 200,000 volts. If it's 3 meters long, it's 300,000 volts. So if you think of how long your car is probably 4 or 5 meters long. So you multiply that by 100,000. 500,000, 400,000 volts are being inserted into your car, you know, in a nanosecond. Look at, if you think of the cord on your personal computer and how long it is, you know, it might be a meter long. If it's longer than that, it gets whatever the length of the cord is times 100,000. And your cars and your personal computers and all these electronics are not designed to run on hundreds of thousands of volts, designed to run on a few volts or even a fractions of volts. But why do they do this? What is the purpose of this thing? And they even call it the EMP suitcase, okay? Well, when you're building a factory that has heavy electronic machinery in it, the machinery can fratricide if you put the machines too close together because they put out electromagnetic transients. And so this is designed so that before you even move the machines in, you know, you can figure out, well, what are the voltages going to be and how much screening do I have to put between the machines so that I don't lose my capital investment in the machines. And that's basically what it's for. And for other things too. You can use it near airports to make sure that critical electronics in your airports are far enough away from cars and vehicles parked out there so that electromagnetic transients. So it has a peaceful, benign purpose. But anybody could buy one of these things, and you can build radio frequency weapons from design information on the internet. We did an experiment when I was on the terrorism subcommittee in Congress before 9/11. What was the year before 9/11? We hired a guy who had a master's degree in electrical engineering and gave him a couple of students and gave him a little money and said, using design information available on the internet and only using Radio Shack parts, go build us, take a year and build us a radio frequency weapon. And they came back and built 2 of them. You know, one of them was designed to look like a Xerox machine. It would fit in the crate for a Xerox machine. And the plan was, well, you can mail, this was before 9/11, and security wasn't as great at the Pentagon, but the idea was mail it to the Pentagon, and it will sit in the Pentagon mail room and fry all the electronics in the Pentagon. And the other one was designed to fit in a Volkswagen bus, and you could drive it down Wall Street and short out the computers on Wall Street and cause an economic crisis. I should point out these things are not as dangerous as a nuclear weapon by themselves as an individual, because the range they have is much shorter, less than a kilometer. But, if a terrorist or a madman or a disgruntled individual had got his hands on one of these and put it in the trunk of a car and drove to an EHV transformer substation outside of a major city, outside of Denver, well, we've arrived at a place, where the technology has now so advanced, both in its capabilities and our dependency on it, that a single individual could topple the technological pillars of civilization for an entire metropolitan area, just one person with one device. And if he drove around the country, to different EHV transformer substations, we have 2,000 EHV transformer substations. I should explain what an EHV transformer is, and I will after this, but just take my word for the moment. EHV transformers are the foundation stones of our modern electronic civilization. They are to us what aqueducts and roads were to the Romans. We can't live without them. They support the electric grid, and we can't afford to lose them. We've got 2,000 of them in this country, and if some character, a terrorist, a criminal, an insane person, knew which 9 to take out, you don't have to take out all 2,000. You only have to take out a fraction of them, and it could be as few as 9. If you knew which 9 ones to attack, you could cause a nationwide blackout for 18 months, even without a nuclear weapon and without a geomagnetic superstorm that would kill 90% of the population. So this is a serious concern as well. So those are the 3 big threats: the sun, the nuclear EMP, and the non-nuclear radio frequency weapons. Now let me just give a little discourse on EHV transformers before we move on in the briefing, and why those things are so important. The modern electric grid, the electric grid that we have today, was invented in this country by Nikola Tesla, and he invented the whole thing. He was in competition with Edison, actually, and Edison had a different kind of grid he was trying to build based on DC current, and Tesla's grid was based on alternating current. And the heart of it, the problem with Edison's grid is he couldn't get DC current to travel long distances to power things, but Tesla could use AC current to do that through the extra high voltage transformer. What this is, it's a huge coil, in effect, that basically speeds up or slows down the electricity, and it can project electricity across huge distances. So you can take electricity from Niagara Falls and send it all the way down to New York City. And then there's another transformer at the end of the line that steps the power down so it can be consumed locally in New York City. And that's all it does. But it's what makes our modern civilization work. And the other part of that thing, because it's not all just about EHV transformers, but the SCADAs are the other thing that are just as important. These are supervisory, control, and data acquisition systems. And they control things even beyond the electric grid. They're basically little computers, and they can regulate the way electricity flows into these transformers. They regulate the way water flows through a pipe, the way natural gas flows through a pipe. They regulate the traffic lights. I mean, they're everywhere. There are millions of them, and our society won't work without them. And so these are the 2 things, and both of them are vulnerable, particularly the SCADAs, to EMP. And these EHV transformers are so important. And they're the size of a house. They weigh hundreds of tons. Sadly, we don't make them in this country anymore. We're starting to try to make them again. We have a few plans, but we, up until, we exported the electric grid to the whole world, our invention, and now we have to import our EHV transformers from South Korea and Germany, which are the only 2 places in the world that make them for export. And they're so hard to make. They have to be made by hand, just the way Nikola Tesla made them. Every one has a unique role, and so you can't mass produce them. The total world production of EHV transformers is less than 200 a year, and we have 2,000. Imagine if we lost 2,000 EHV transformers. It would take the entire world's global production 10 years to replace all of our transformers. And it's not easy to replace them. There's only 3 railway cars in the whole country that can carry one of these things because they weigh so much. And bridges have to be widened and strengthened. Highways have to be widened and strengthened. Wouldn't it just be smarter to protect the transformer so it doesn't get destroyed in the first place? That's what we're advocating. But our brilliant government under the last administration, their plan, they're trying to develop this thing called the reliable replacement transformer, okay? So that if we lose transformers, they can move the transformer, and they're trying to make it a smaller, lighter, easier to move transformer. You know, for onesies and twosies, you know, that might be okay, but for an EMP scenario where you lose hundreds of transformers, that's not going to work. You know, and so far we have been unsuccessful in convincing the electric power industry to protect its transformers. Let me move on. Okay, North Korea. We were talking about North Korea. This is actually a photograph from 2013. Up to that point, it was the greatest nuclear crisis we had with North Korea. This is a picture of Kim Jong-un with his general staff. Can't see it well, but on the back, on the map he has behind him, is a plan to, you know, his nuclear missile strikes directed against the United States. And he has tested nuclear weapons. We believe, the Commission believes, that North Korea probably has got what we call a super EMP weapon. It's a nuclear weapon of special design to generate gamma rays, which is what makes the EMP effect. And that's why its nuclear tests, most of the world has been deriding the North Korean weapons as not working because the yields have been so low. And like their first test was only 1 to 3 kilotons, you know. But that was a kiloton is 1,000 tons. That's a third the size of the Hiroshima bomb. But these super EMP weapons are not designed to make a big explosion. They're designed to produce gamma rays, so they look like they have low yields. And we were told, we think Russia, I believe personally, okay, but it's almost a virtual certainty that Russia transferred their design for a super EMP weapon to North Korea on purpose, because they demarched us in 2004 to warn us about this. This was before the North Koreans did their first test in 2006. They said, excuse us. They sent 2 Russian generals, their top EMP experts, to tell us that they had super EMP weapons, the Russians did, and by accident, the design for the super EMP weapon had been transferred to the North Koreans. And that not because of the policy of the Russian government, but because they were having economic problems, there had been brain drain from Russia. So some of their nuclear engineers and missile scientists were in North Korea helping North Koreans develop nuclear and missiles, and Chinese were also there too, according to these Russian generals. And they said, it's so easy to build one of these weapons that they could, in 2 years, do a test. And right on the money, in 2006, North Korea did its first test, just as predicted by the Russian generals. And it was this low-yield, 1 to 3 kiloton weapon that looks just like a super EMP weapon. This is the track of the KSM-3 satellite that the North Koreans launched in December of 2012, but it came into play. They knew they were going to have a crisis with us in 2013, early on in 2013, and it was like they sent this satellite up probably so they could have this presence, you know, when the event occurred, because they were experimenting with this new way of warfare in the midst of a crisis. The object being to have this, they did their illegal nuclear test, which caused a nuclear crisis. Kim Jong-un started threatening to make missile strikes against the United States, to destroy the United States with a nuclear attack. President Obama, on this date, on the date April 16th, 2013, April 16th, 2013, told the New York Times that Kim Jong-un couldn't deliver on his nuclear missile threats. And on that very day, you know, the KMS-3 followed, see, this is the 16th, followed this track here, and it flew right over Washington, D.C., okay, when he was telling them that they couldn't reach out and hit us with anything. And on that same day, there was an attack, a mysterious attack that still has not been solved in California on the western grid that attacked the San Jose Metcalf transformer substation. You know, some group of commandos, you know, went out there, used AK-47s, the favorite sidearm of terrorists and rogue states, to shoot up transformers. And it wasn't just some random thing. The U.S. Navy SEALs investigated this, and they judged that this attack was a professional attack, just the way the SEALs themselves would execute it. They knew there was an underground tunnel They knew how to get in there. They knew how to cut the fiber optic cables that would notify the police and notify the control station so that they could do their work unopposed. They had pre-surveyed firing positions. They knew just where to shoot on the transformers to damage them. And they knew just how far to go so that they wouldn't destroy them. Because in the judgment of the SEALs, they didn't want to destroy the transformers. They were testing our reaction time, you know, because when you do a military exercise, like when the Russians send a bomber up around Alaska, they don't actually launch a nuclear cruise missile, all right? That would not only start a war, but it would certainly put us, it would warn us about our vulnerability, and we would do everything possible to make sure something like that would never happen again. So they, in the judgment of the SEALs, they didn't want to actually destroy the transformers and cause a catastrophic blackout, because then we would be on our guard and we would repair this vulnerability. They just wanted to see how much they could get away with. They actually, the attack went on literally to the last minute, 60 seconds after the cops finally showed up. They just disappeared into the night, and we have never found out who did this. This was back in 2013. You know, 4 years later, you know, we still don't know who did it. But it happened in the middle of the nuclear crisis with North Korea. And it happened on the same day that they orbited the satellite over the eastern grid. Okay? So there was an attack on the western grid, there was an attack on the eastern grid. There were also cyber attacks happening all this time as well, you know, testing our defenses. And in the aftermath of the height of the crisis, that was the height of the crisis. I won't get into some of this technical stuff. That's just what an EMP attack on the eastern grid would look like. Here are extra generation plants. Those would have been, you know, if one of those, if you did an attack on the eastern grid and put the EMP field down, the ones in red are the ones that would go. One of the nightmare scenarios happened during this nuclear crisis with North Korea. One of our nightmare scenarios that we anticipated before, years before this happened, the EMP Commission was concerned about a country like Iran or North Korea or terrorists getting their hands on a nuclear weapon and a short-range missile and putting it on a freighter and then firing it from near our coasts. And this actually, and this is a Scud ballistic missile on its launcher, you know, artist depiction, and this is the real thing down there in the lower left of what it looks like, you know. And a Scud can carry a nuclear weapon. The advantages of doing this are you keep your fingerprints off the attack, you know, because terrorist groups, all kinds of countries have freighters. Scuds are very common missiles. You know, even terrorists have Scud missiles. You know, the Houthis in Yemen have Scud missiles. They actually managed to kill the chief of staff of the Saudi Arabian Air Force a couple of years ago, you know, with a Scud missile attack on King Khalid Air Force Base. So terrorist groups have Scud missiles, and they have access to freighters. The only thing they don't have is a nuclear weapon, we hope, okay? So there's only one piece of the puzzle missing for them to give them, even terrorist groups, the ability to threaten the existence of our civilization. And in the aftermath of that 2013 crisis, you know, which what we were talking about before was the height of the crisis, but as it went into its denouement, into the summer, in July, we caught a North Korean freighter trying to go back, the Chonchong gang, trying to sneak back to North Korea to the Panama Canal. And you know, we didn't know it at the time. This freighter was notorious for smuggling drugs and small arms to criminal and terrorist organizations. But when they went and inspected the freighter, they found hidden under thousands of bags of sugar, they found this. They found two of these. You know, two SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. You know, they didn't have nuclear warheads on them, but they're designed to carry a 10-kiloton warhead. That's the size of a warhead that destroyed Hiroshima. And they were both on their launchers, hidden under thousands of bags of sugar, basically. And what it looked like is, you know, the North Korean freighter during the crisis had come in from the Atlantic side, and we didn't even know they were down there in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, they could have, had they had a nuclear weapon on one of these things, we wouldn't even have known it. And they could have gone up to the Gulf of Mexico and made the kind of an attack that we're talking about, this short-range EMP attack, and taken out the eastern grid. And it was almost as if, I think it was likely, that they said, well, the Americans have never figured out that we're here. How much can we get away with? Let's see if we can get through the Panama Canal. It's shorter to go back to North Korea that way. And that's where they made their mistake. You know, in fact, we got a clue that something was up because when we boarded that ship, you know, the captain tried to commit suicide and the crew physically resisted, you know, to try to keep us from boarding it, which was unusual. You know, usually if it's drugs or something like that, they just let the police do their thing. But this level of resistance raised people's alarm, and so we suspected there was something more than just the smuggling of drugs or small arms, and that's what we found. So the North Koreans experimented with all the dimensions of this new way of warfare I had been talking about before. You know, we have satellites, you know, that potentially could be nuclear armed with the EMP, cyber attacks happening while this happened, an active physical sabotage out in the western coast, and now short-range missiles a couple of months after the height of it, you know, in a freighter off our coast. This is what I call a clear and present danger, by the way. And this, there have been a number of incidents, you know, before, in 2013, we had an incident happen just before Halloween in 2013, where the Knights Templar, they're a terrorist drug cartel, took out, they used explosives and small arms to cause blackouts in grids in Mexico that put about 500,000 people into the dark, so they could go into the towns and villages and drag out village elders who were opposed to the drug trade and murder them in public. The idea was the blackout that kept the federales from coming in, so they didn't know what was going on. When the Knights Templars, when Neanderthals like the Knights Templars have figured out the electric grid is a major societal vulnerability, you know, what if Al-Qaeda, ISIS, North Korea, Iran, these more sophisticated actors that have much greater resources at their disposal, what are they thinking? One of the things they're thinking is ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In June 9th, 2014, this is the first time in history, a terrorist group blacked out a whole nation. They used small arms, you know, to black out the whole country of Yemen. You know, they put 24 million people in 19 cities into the dark, temporarily. It wasn't a protracted blackout. You know, but it's the first time in history that terrorists did it. So obviously, Al-Qaeda understands, you know, that this is an Achilles heel. And it had significant geostrategic implications, because up to this point, Yemen had been a staunch U.S. ally. But after this, it so destabilized the government that the Houthis basically took over, and now Yemen is pretty much in Iran's camp, and this was a major contributing factor to it, where in effect you had a blackout war that has had real consequences for an important U.S. ally. That's a picture of one of the downed electric towers in Yemen. In Pakistan, the terrorists blacked out Pakistan, which is a nuclear weapons state, for a couple of days, again by using conventional weapons to black out their grid. Turkey was blacked out temporarily by an Iranian cyber attack on that date, March 31st. And the Russians blacked out about half of Ukraine using a cyber attack. Now, you can't read that small writing, but, you know, so what is going on? What does all this signify? Well, you know, what I think it signifies, and what the Commission thinks it signifies, is that we're in the situation that we were in 1936, 37, 38, just before World War II. You know, the Nazis had developed a revolutionary new way of warfare called the Blitzkrieg. The Japanese had developed a revolutionary new way of warfare that didn't rely on battleships, but relied on carrier aircraft. And there were a handful of people within our civilizations, within the Western democracies, that realized this, a handful of them. Billy Mitchell tried to warn Congress about the aircraft carrier threat. Nobody listened to him. Actually, his career suffered because the Navy wanted battleships, okay? The only reason we ended up with any aircraft carriers is a guy named Carl Vincent, who was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee at the time, said, Billy Mitchell is right. I want you guys to build some aircraft carriers. And that's the only reason the Navy did it, against their will. You know, Churchill and Major General Fuller were warning about this thing called the Blitzkrieg, that the Nazis were training and exercising with a new combined arms kind of trying to restore movement to the battlefield with tanks and mobile infantry and mobile artillery combined with air power, all in close coordination, a new way of warfare that was going to be just devastating. And it would overrun the trenches and barbed wire, that we'd had during World War I. It was going to be a completely new way of warfare. And Neville Chamberlain and 99% of the intellectuals, didn't listen to him and thought, well, that's not true. Anyone who would want to launch a new war would be a madman, and the next war is going to be like World War I, because they couldn't wrap their minds. So it was a failure of strategic imagination, both for the way of warfare presaged by Billy Mitchell in aircraft carrier warfare and for the Blitzkrieg. And as a consequence of that, we nearly lost Western civilization then to the Nazis and the Japanese. We came very close to losing that war. And the only reason we managed to win it, it cost millions of lives, in Russia and on the battlefields of North Africa, for us to learn how to fight the Blitzkrieg and how to learn to fight against aircraft carriers. The blood of our soldiers had to be spilled to turn the tide. And by the grace of God, we were able to do it. But I had started off by saying I think we're in a position equivalent to 36, 37, 38, because just like people couldn't get, there was a failure of strategic imagination about that way of warfare, about the Blitzkrieg and carrier warfare. There's a failure of strategic imagination among the Western democracies now about the real way cyber warfare is going to work and how our enemies are planning for it. Because we can't get our heads around this idea of a nuclear EMP attack combined with cyber warfare, combined with physical sabotage in close coordination, and with non-nuclear EMP weapons. They write about it, and openly, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. These bullet points are basically taken from translations from a Russian military textbook. It's a Soviet-era military textbook. But I just thought it might be interesting to do an experiment of the imagination here for this audience. One of the things I found was hardest to do when I was a military analyst. And, they read my background to you. I was analyzing Soviet and then Russian military strategy and doctrine. And one of the hardest things to do is get outside of your own society and your own civilization and stand in the shoes of a different one and understand the way they see the world, okay? And why this different way of warfare, the way they would wage warfare differently from us, why that makes sense from their perspective. So let's try, all of us, for a moment here, on this view graph, to think like a Russian general staff officer who has been trained to think about history in this way. It's probably too small for you to read, but I'll just go through it. They have a very different perspective on the history of mankind, all right? What this talks about, this is from Soviet Major General P.A. Zhilin's The History of Military Art. And he talks about the evolution of warfare across history. And this textbook is still taught today in the Russian General Staff Academy, Voroshilov General Staff Academy. And the way they see human history as unfolding is in a series of revolution, what they call a revolution in military affairs. When a new technology comes online that is so powerful, and a new imaginative way of using that technology that is so powerful that it enables one civilization to replace another. And so, in the first agrarian civilizations in ancient Egypt, for example, they had the resources to build chariots, large numbers of chariot armies, and they were able to conquer the city-states and meld them into empires. And then the early empires, these early agrarian empires, like the Persian Empire, which was the largest empire of the classical world up to that time that was based on that technology, was overwhelmed by a new technology that came out of Greece and out of the mind of Alexander the Great, which was the Macedonian phalanx used in combination with cavalry. The Macedonian phalanx was basically a longer spear, that was 16 feet long versus the 8-foot long spears the Persian used, but used in combination with archers and cavalry in such an ingenious way that at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander, with 20,000 men, was able to defeat and rout a Persian army of 150,000 men. Revolution in military affairs. And it basically replaced the Persian civilization with Greek civilization and introduced the Hellenistic age, which in turn was displaced by the Roman Empire, which came along with better technology and better ways of warfare. They invented the first siege machines and scorpions, small catapults that were like the early artillery. The Roman legions were organized in a different way, a better way than the Macedonian phalanx, so that they were able to defeat Greek-trained style armies on the battlefield, and hence you had the rise of Rome. The feudal era, eventually Rome falls, and it's interesting too in terms of why Rome falls. Rome falls to the barbarians, in part because of corruption, but also because the barbarians figure out how to attack the critical infrastructures of the Roman Empire, knocking down aqueducts, banditry so that it becomes unsafe to travel on the roads. At the end of the Roman Empire, when the Visigoths knocked down the aqueducts, the population of Rome in one generation went from 1 million people to 10,000 people living in the city of Rome, because you couldn't support 1 million people without water in the city of Rome. But on and on they go through these examples. The invention of gunpowder in the feudal age makes, you have the rise of castles in the aftermath of Rome, because there is no more an empire. You have a barbaric world. You don't even have nation states anymore. But the technology of the castle is the dominant technology, and which gives rise to a civilization of feudal barons, who then yield to a civilization of kings and nation states again because of the invention of gunpowder and catapults that can take down castle walls. The Napoleonic era is the rise of the mass civilian army again that hadn't been seen since the Roman Empire. The idea of a citizen army instead of a small professional army enabled you to put 1 million troops in the field, and also to harness the idea of a total war under Napoleon, where you could harness all of the economy of the society, to basically serve the purpose of war. And this enabled Napoleon to come close to conquering the world. World War I is the first scientific war, in this Soviet-Russian view of history, where we harness the machine gun for mass killing, barbed wire, chemical weapons. We already talked about World War II and that revolution in military affairs. And at the end of this book, it's the nuclear missile age. And this was considered, I'm talking about the Soviet era now, the decisive instrument, the nuclear weapon, nuclear missiles. And because the Soviet